I've always been a huge fan of horror shows. There's something about the suspense and the thrill of watching something terrifying unfold that fascinates me. I would binge watch all sorts of horror series, diving deep into twisted tales of ghosts, demons, and haunted places. It was a way for me to escape reality, immersing myself in these terrifying worlds, but I never thought anything like that could actually happen to me. After all, they were just stories, right? Despite all the horror I watched, I never had a real, frightening experience. I'd heard of people having sleep paralysis or encountering strange things, but I always assumed those were just exaggerations or figments of imagination. Sleep paralysis in particular seemed like something straight out of a horror movie. It didn't seem like something that could happen to someone like me, someone who was just an ordinary person enjoying their favorite shows. Little did I know that one night, everything would change. That's when the nightmare started, one that felt all too real and one that I would never forget. One night, after watching an especially eerie horror series, I went to bed feeling unsettled, but still trying to shake off the tension of the show. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself in a vivid nightmare that I couldn't escape. In it, there was a man I had never seen before, looming over me. He climbed on top of me, his presence suffocating, and I could feel the weight of him pressing down. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I struggled, unable to move, and then, as if by some miracle, I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. As I sat up in bed, trying to steady my breathing, I noticed something strange. There, on my stomach, was a mark, an odd, dark impression that hadn't been there before. I ran my fingers over it, confused and disoriented. It didn't hurt, but it was real. I couldn't understand how it had appeared. My mind raced, but in my tired state, I chalked it up to the vividness of the nightmare. Perhaps it was just some kind of phantom sensation from my dream. I convinced myself that it was nothing more than the result of a restless night, and decided to go back to sleep, hoping the strange feeling would fade away. But little did I know, this was only the beginning of something far more sinister. The following night, as I lay in bed, just on the edge of sleep, I saw him again. The same man from my nightmare, standing beside my bed, his eyes locked onto mine. I froze. It wasn't a dream this time. He was real. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. The terrifying truth hit me. I was experiencing sleep paralysis, something I had only ever heard of in stories. Couldn't scream, couldn't call for help. I was trapped inside my own body, unable to escape the horror unfolding before me. The man began to move closer, his steps slow and deliberate. As he drew nearer, I could see his face start to change, shifting grotesquely. His features melted and distorted, as if his skin was being pulled into unnatural shapes. His eyes grew larger, darker, and his teeth elongated into jagged fangs. His nails, too, stretched and curved into horrifying, sharp claws. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, unable to do anything as this nightmare came to life. With every step he took, the air grew heavier, colder, and I could feel his presence closing in on me. The more he moved, the more his form twisted into something unrecognizable, a nightmarish creature that no human should ever see. Finally, he climbed onto the bed and hovered over me, his laughter echoing in the silence of the room. I tried again to fight, to break free, but I couldn't. I could only lie there, crying silently as his hands, now monstrous claws, pressed down on the mark on my stomach. The pressure was unbearable, and with it came an overwhelming weakness that coursed through my entire body. It was as though he was draining me of all my strength, leaving me powerless to do anything but watch him smile, savoring every moment of my fear. I was helpless, unable to stop him as the darkness in the room seemed to close in tighter around me. After what felt like an eternity, the man suddenly vanished, fading into the shadows, as though he had never been there at all. The weight that had been suffocating me lifted, and with it, the strange mark on my stomach disappeared as well. I was finally able to move, but my body felt weak and drained, as if all the energy had been sucked out of me. I lay there trembling and completely exhausted, but somehow I managed to gather the strength to pull myself together. Still shaken, I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a horrible dream. I closed my eyes, hoping to forget everything and fall back asleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling incredibly weak, my muscles aching and my mind foggy, but I pushed through it, telling myself that it had to have been just an intense, vivid nightmare. The mark on my stomach was gone and everything seemed like it was back to normal, or so I tried to believe. I went about my day as usual, trying to keep busy, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had happened, something I couldn't explain. I went through my routine, but every now and then I found myself glancing at the spot where the man had stood beside my bed the night before. My mind kept drifting back to his face, his twisted features, and the grotesque claws that had hovered so dangerously close to me. I kept telling myself it was just a dream, that there was no way something supernatural had happened. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to push it all away, but the fear lingered, just beneath the surface, haunting me in a way I couldn't explain. As the day went on, I tried to continue with life as normal, but that night, as I prepared for bed, the unease returned. I couldn't help but wonder if the nightmare had really ended, or if something more sinister was still lurking in the shadows. The next morning, as I was still trying to shake off the remnants of the terrifying experience, my mother walked into my room. She looked at me with concern and told me that she had seen me shaking violently in my sleep the night before. Worried, she had covered me with a blanket, thinking I was just cold. But as she spoke, a chill ran down my spine. I hadn't been cold, not at all. I had been trembling from something much worse, something that couldn't be explained by a mere drop in temperature. The realization hit me like a wave. The man from my dreams, the horrifying figure who had tormented me, hadn't just been a product of my imagination. He had been there, in my room. I couldn't deny it any longer. I had felt his presence, the weight of his stare, his chilling proximity as he hovered above me. My body trembled just thinking about it, and the fear that had been simmering inside me began to boil over. Had I really been asleep when it happened, or had it been real? The terrifying thought kept growing in my mind, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. How could I explain what had happened? The mark on my stomach, the paralyzing fear, the man who had been so real in my dreams, none of it made sense. My thoughts felt scattered, and the line between reality and nightmare was becoming increasingly blurry. Was I losing my mind? Or had something truly supernatural happened to me? The fear only deepened as I realized that the man wasn't just a figment of my imagination. He had been there, in my home, in my space, watching me. I could feel his presence even now, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I didn't know how to escape it, or even if it was possible. All I knew was that I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted by something far more sinister than I could comprehend. I've been working as a nurse in an old hospital in a small town for a few years now. My shift starts at 7 p.m. and goes until 6 a.m., and I'm in charge of taking care of an elderly patient. The hospital is quite isolated, nestled away from the main part of town, which only adds to its eerie atmosphere. The building itself is old, with creaky floors and peeling paint, and sometimes it feels like the place has been forgotten by time itself. The hallways are long and narrow, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Despite still being in operation, there's a sense of abandonment that permeates the place. At night, the silence is overwhelming. The only sounds are the occasional footsteps echoing down the empty corridors and the soft hum of the old machines. It's strange, comforting in its own way, but also deeply unsettling, as if the walls are holding on to secrets, just waiting for someone to uncover them. Being alone in the hospital at night gives me a sense of isolation, and after a while, I started to feel like something was off. The quiet that surrounded me wasn't peaceful anymore. It was suffocating. There were nights when I could swear I heard whispers or the soft shuffle of footsteps, though I was the only one on duty. But for the most part, I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. One night, while I was sitting by my patient's bedside, we were chatting quietly. It was just another calm late shift, or so I thought. As we talked, something caught my eye through the glass window of the hallway. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I focused, I saw it clearly, two hands pressed against the window as if they were reaching out, begging for help. The sight froze me in place. There was no one else around. My heart began to race as I stood up, convinced someone was playing a prank on me. I rushed out of the room and through the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I reached the spot where the hands had been, but when I stepped outside, the hallway was empty. No one was there, and there was no sign of anyone having been there. My pulse was pounding in my ears, but I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks in the dark. When I returned to my patient's room, I couldn't keep the unease from showing on my face. She noticed and asked me what happened. Hesitant, I told her about the strange hands I'd seen. To my surprise, she wasn't shocked. In fact, she seemed almost resigned. She told me that this wasn't the first time something like that had happened. Other nurses had seen things too, disembodied hands, shadows that moved, and strange noises in the dead of night. It was almost like it was a regular occurrence at this hospital. That's when I began to feel a shift. The oddities weren't just coincidences. Something was wrong here, something beyond the natural. The feeling of unease that had been growing inside me suddenly felt more real, more tangible. And as much as I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that the hospital itself was hiding something supernatural. One night, after a long shift and unable to sleep, I decided to head to the small hospital kitchen. The exhaustion weighed heavily on me, and the oppressive silence of the building only made things worse. I felt on edge, like something wasn't right. It wasn't just the fatigue. There was an eerie tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press down on me as I walked down the empty halls. The loneliness of the hospital at night had always been unsettling, but tonight it felt different. I made my way into the kitchen and sat down at the small table, hoping a strong cup of coffee would shake off the weariness. The kitchen, like the rest of the hospital, had an old, neglected feel to it. The dim fluorescent light flickered slightly above me, casting strange shadows across the room. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my rosary, a habit I'd developed to calm my nerves. As I began to quietly pray, trying to find some peace in the unsettling atmosphere, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Out of nowhere, a disposable food container flew off the counter and hit me square in the chest. It splattered remnants of food all over my hospital uniform, and I froze in shock. No one else was in the kitchen. There was no one around to explain what had just happened. I looked around the room, expecting to find someone playing a prank, but the kitchen was empty. The only thing I could feel was a growing sense of dread, as though the room itself was watching me. I had never felt so unwelcome. My hands trembled as I picked up the rosary again, the weight of the moment sinking in. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever force was in the kitchen didn't want me. I quickly finished my prayer, feeling the eyes of something unseen on me. The oppressive silence returned, but it wasn't the usual calm. It was suffocating, charged with an eerie presence. I couldn't help but think that whatever was here, it didn't want me to stay. Panicking, I rushed to the door, desperate to get out of the kitchen and away from the feeling of being watched. But just as I reached the door, something I couldn't explain happened. With a violent force, the door slammed shut, crashing into the wall with such intensity that part of the lock broke off. I stumbled back, barely avoiding being crushed by the door. My heart raced, and I was left standing there, frozen with fear. If I hadn't acted quickly, I might have been seriously hurt. The terror was overwhelming. My body shook uncontrollably, and tears began to stream down my face as I realized that I was truly alone in that room. Yet, not alone at all. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I couldn't make a sound. I felt paralyzed, as though the very air around me was pressing in, suffocating me. I cried in sheer panic, unable to understand what was happening or how to stop it. The weight of the situation was too much to bear. It wasn't long before a few of the nurses arrived, alerted by my cries. They rushed to the door and managed to open it, but when they stepped into the kitchen, there was nothing there. No one. The room was exactly as I had left it, except for the broken door lock and the spilled food. I tried to explain what had just happened, but no one seemed to believe me. They just stared at me, as if I were overreacting or imagining things. "There's nothing here," one of them said dismissively. "You must have been tired." I wanted to argue, to make them understand, but the fear still gripped me. The door had slammed on its own, and yet they acted like it was just a coincidence. There were no windows in that kitchen. No draft, no logical explanation for what I had just experienced. But the nurses dismissed me, brushing it off as if it were nothing. That night, I knew that I couldn't stay in that hospital any longer, not alone, not with whatever force was haunting the halls. After the incident, I couldn't shake the feeling of terror that had gripped me. Even though I continued to care for the patient for a while longer, something inside me had changed. I could no longer walk through those halls alone at night. Every shadow seemed to hold a thread. Every creak of the old building echoed in my mind, reminding me of the things I had witnessed. The once familiar corridors now felt like a maze of fear, and I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. The fear I had experienced that night grew over the following days. I began to feel as though I was constantly being followed, even when no one was around. The hospital, once just a place of work, had transformed into a nightmarish realm where I no longer felt safe. It was as if something malevolent had taken root there, lingering in the dark corners, watching, waiting for the right moment to make its move. I would find myself jumping at the slightest sound, my heart racing whenever I passed through empty hallways. The atmosphere had become unbearable. I couldn't help but feel like I was being drawn into something I couldn't understand, something far darker than just an old hospital. The feeling of dread never left, like a constant weight pressing on my chest, making it harder to breathe. It wasn't just fear of the unknown anymore. It was the certainty that whatever haunted that place wasn't finished yet. In the end, I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't continue working in a place that felt more like a prison than a hospital. The terror had seeped into my bones, and no matter how many times I told myself it was just my imagination, deep down, I knew something evil still lingered there, waiting. I had to leave. The hospital would never feel safe again, and neither would I.